This is a story that's got secret societies, rebellions and insurrections, torture and death at the stake, and oodles of unashamed magic. But not, of course, if you chose to read the standard history books. The histories of science doesn't really crop up too much. Right, now, most people, obviously like us, think that the scientific revolution started with Copernicus's heliocentric theory in 1543 and ended with Isaac Newton and his Principia Mathematica, his principles of mathematics, in 1687, with Galileo somewhere in the middle. And I hope you realise I was just pretending to consult my notes about those dates because, you know, I just didn't want you to feel bad. You know, and so the whole scientific revolution was just really 150 years from Copernicus to Newton, and if you listen to the likes of Richard Dawkins, then that's basically the history of, certainly in the West, humankind moving from superstition to enlightenment. That's what the likes would have us believe. But of course, I am preaching very largely to the converted here, I realise, but that's not the way it was. History has been radically rewritten, but that's what this conference is for, setting the record straight. In reality, science, as we know it, owes its origins to a belief system that the likes of Dawkins would regard as more horrifically superstitious even than Christianity. This is based on a very specific, one specific set of ancient texts, if you like, encompassing a very specific magical current. And the pioneers, every single pioneer of the scientific revolution, without exception, was inspired by these ancient texts. This set of texts has had the greatest effect on Western civilization than any other set of texts apart from the Bible. And it's had the greatest effect on modern Western civilization than any set of texts, including the Bible, and yet very few people have even heard of it. This, I'm referring to the Hermetica, the Hermetic books. Every major figure, and this is no wild exaggeration, every single major figure of the scientific revolution was directly inspired by the Hermetica. Now, the name Hermetica comes from an attribution of the text to a legendary Egyptian man-god called Hermes Trismegistus, or however else you might pronounce the name. The books were written in Egypt during the time of the Greek and Roman domination, so late BC, early AD, but their core ideas can indeed be traced right back into ancient Egypt, to the time of the pyramid builders, to the time of the great Heliopolitan religion. I mean, this whole connection with ancient Egypt has long been doubted by scholars because they think of the Hermetica as basically being Greek. But as I say, the core ideas can be traced right back. And in fact, it does seem that the books were intended to preserve certain ancient Egyptian religions in the face of the new Greek traditions being imposed upon them. It's all in our book, The Forbidden Universe. But apart from bits, fragments here and there, this astonishing set of texts, the Hermetica, basically it was lost to Europe. And mainly thanks to the crackdown on pagan scholarship after Christianity became the state religion in the 4th century. Don't you just love the early Christians? However, the Hermetic books did survive in the East, in the Middle East, and Europe did rediscover them. It was 1463 when Cosimo de' Medici had 14 of these treatises called the Corpus Hermeticum, translated by Ficino. You hear all sorts of things. Mainly it was the Greek text that kicked off the Renaissance. No, it wasn't. It was the rediscovery and translation of the Hermetica that kicked off the Renaissance for various reasons, which I shall go into in a moment. But the Hermetica was so important and seen immediately as so important, and he had been sought after indeed by Cosimo de' Medici, that when he got hold of the text and gave them to Ficino to translate, basically he said to Ficino, what are you working on now? Ficino said, oh, I'm translating Plato. He said, oh, forget that rubbish. He said, concentrate on this. So they were in no doubt of basically the explosive text that they had. But of course, as we know, as history has shown, that the impact of the Hermetic books has been so radically downplayed as to be scandalous. But in their day, they were intoxicating. They were electrifying. The chattering classes, the men at universities, people with half a brain cell, everybody who heard of them were just entranced. It just changed everything. One of the reasons for this was that they promoted a magical vision of the world. To them, the cosmos was a living thing, where everything was effectively God's thought. Everything, every single thing, if they'd thought in these terms, every cell of every single thing was divine. And human beings, they believed, had a special place in the scheme of things. It's through us, they believed, that the universe becomes conscious of itself. Now, I want you to remember that. They believed that it's through humanity that the universe becomes conscious of itself, because we're going to come back to that much later on. And of course, you see, one of the reasons that the intelligentsia of the day were so hungry for these texts was that humanity, the way one saw oneself, the way one saw one's place in society and in humanity in general, was suddenly overnight drastically changed, radically changed. Because before, largely, there were the emergent Protestantism, various cults, but basically it was still the Catholic worldview, that you were born a miserable worm, that men, and I do mean men, by the way, even the bright, no, wait, it's not quite the insult it sounds. Came out all wrong, that. That even the brightest of men were basically miserable worms and who crawled around and, without much hope for anything. Anything they might have achieved was through God's grace through the church. And basically you owed your very existence in this life and certainly in the next to the church. So you gave them money to let you off a bit of purgatory here and there. But that was basically, the brightest of men were seen as just worms, basically, sort of born in sin, etc., not getting much better. You notice I don't mention women, but because actually women were not only deemed not capable of being bright, but there was a very real debate going on at around that time whether women had souls. The Hermetic works, as I say, were absolutely electrifying, and one of the other reasons that the people who read them, that the scholars were eating them up, was that they represented a source of wisdom that was older than the Old Testament. I mean, wow, But the most important reason was that human beings were seen as brilliant creatures with almost unlimited potential. And now I'm saying people, not just men, because the Hermeticists had a view that encompassed women. It was men and women, it was humanity, not just mankind. And we're all capable of becoming gods. As they said, the human is a godlike living thing. And the great Hermetic adage is, magnum miraculum est homo, man is a great miracle, and women too. And as we've seen, it was so different. It couldn't be any more different from the Catholic view of humanity. And virtually overnight, it just opened your mind. I mean, it was like you'd been shuffling along looking down and suddenly it was kind of, wow, here we are then, an unlimited potential. The effect, the almost instant effect of that kind of paradigm shift was that humanity, the movers and shakers, the artists, the craftsmen, the thinkers, they suddenly had this great surge of confidence. Anything was possible. And indeed, they went on to show the most amazing burst of creative energy. And that's why and how the Hermetica kicked off the Renaissance. It was an attitude thing, apart from any facts that might be involved there. It was an attitude thing. It changed people's attitudes. And a lot has been written about the Hermetica's influence on the art and culture of the day. I mean, that is absolutely non-controversial. But few realise it had an enormous effect, an incredible effect, on the scientific revolution too, which is what we're going to come to. And as I said at the beginning, the scientific revolution began with Copernicus's new theory that the Earth circles the sun and not the other way round. He wrote on the revolution of the celestial spheres, 1543. But where did he get his theory from? You might think, well, the man was a genius, it just came to him, he worked it out or something. No, he did get it from somewhere. You might be slightly ahead of me here. A big clue about where he got the heliocentric theory from is there on the very page of his book that shows his famous diagram of the solar system with the Earth and other planets orbiting the Sun. Just 4 lines below this famous diagram, he quotes a passage from the Hermetica, where Hermes Trismegistus describes the Sun as a visible god. This is only a tiny bit of a whole passage, basically about heliocentricity in the Hermetica. And in fact, all of Copernicus's radical notions were lifted from the Hermetica. He proposed that the Earth orbits the Sun and that it rotates on its own axis. That's to explain why the Sun appears to go around us. And the Hermetica talks about the rotation of the world. And as it turns, the world changes. And of course, as I say, his greatest contribution was heliocentricity, that the Sun is at the centre, not the Earth. And this is stated several times in the Corpus Hermeticum. For example, for the Sun is situated at the centre of the cosmos, wearing it like a crown. And also around the Sun are the 6 spheres that depend from it, the sphere of the stars, the planets, and the one that surrounds the Earth. Now, spheres, scholars now recognise, equates to orbits. So basically, there's no other way to read this statement other than saying that the Earth and planets circle the Sun. Now, I'm going off a little tangent here because it's something I absolutely love. When I'm talking about what a big impact, a radical, electrifying impact the Hermetica had on throughout Europe. I'm just looking at one rather famous English name and his views on, well, not his views, but certainly the impact the Hermetica had on him, a certain William Shakespeare. There's a line in Hamlet which is often otherwise thought of as being somewhat just flowery, it doesn't really mean much, and it's a bit obscure, which is Hamlet says, "I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself a king of infinite space." Well, okay, it's wonderful. It's a party for the mouth, like most of Shakespeare. But the background to this line is just lovely. This involves a guy called Thomas Digges, or Digges, D-I-G-G-E-S. He was an English mathematician and astronomer who published the first English defense of Copernicanism in 1576. He did take Copernicus's theory one step further. Copernicus had placed the Sun at the centre, true, but still maintained the traditional idea that the planets were at fixed distances, equally distant from the Sun. Now, Digges argued that the stars are at different distances in an infinite universe. How modern can you get? But, this is the important bit here, Digges exact words in his book were that the cosmos was not enclosed in the stellar sphere as in a nutshell. And there's Shakespeare using the words nutshell and infinite in the same breath. Well, okay, maybe Shakespeare had heard something down a tavern and that, it stuck in his mind. Well, things often do stick in your mind when you're in a tavern. But it's actually not surprising that Shakespeare knew what Digges had written because they shared a house. Shakespeare and Digges shared a house, and Digges' son worked at the Globe Theatre with Shakespeare. And in fact, there is an argument, which is in our book, Forbidden Universe, that the whole of Hamlet is actually a very clever analogy, metaphor rather, for the heliocentric explosion of ideas. Because, for example, the old king is called Claudius, and Ptolemy, who masterminded the ancient system of thinking about the universe, he was called Claudius. And there's all sorts of bits and pieces. There's even the real Rosencrantz and Guildenstern were involved in scientific research, and there's lots and lots of it. And I am just waiting for Mr. Cumberbatch to get back to me about the letter that I wrote about this. I'm sorry, but I'm a little bit fed up about that. Sorry, it's just saying Cumberbatch. Okay, pull yourself together. Right, okay, where were we? Right. So yes, well, Copernicus, you see, was claiming to have found mathematical and physical proof for principles that appear without proof in the Hermetica. In fact, the Hermeticists of the time regarded him as just their hero because they saw him as having vindicated their sacred theory. And actually, already you have this strange, to us perhaps, strange confusion almost of spirituality and science, but it goes on. And many people believe that the church instantly took against Copernicus's theory. But actually, that's not what happened. At the time, senior churchmen were just as entranced as anybody else, and they actively encouraged him to go public. But Copernicus didn't want to because he thought there'd be a hell of a row among certain, his peers, and he didn't particularly want that. So it was kind of his fault. But obviously, fast forward 7 decades, the church did later have very big problems with heliocentricity, as shown by its persecution of Galileo, as I say, 70 years later, who claimed then to have proof of it. It was no longer a theory, it was a fact. So what had changed in the 7 decades? Well, basically, it was the significance that the Hermetic movement attached to Copernicus's theory. In fact, a little-known political element. So we've got the 3 elements. We've got science, we've got spirituality, mysticism, and we have the politics involved with Hermeticism. And sadly, I can only really touch on it now. And I must stress that the Hermetic movement wasn't just a few beardy people, sorry beardy people, but a few beardy people in attics, sort of thinking, oh, this is a bit naughty, but I like this, Hermetic porn, But no, I mean, it was big. I mean, a Hermetic movement attracted kings and emperors and even some popes. Some churchmen, I love this, it's so wonderfully naive and touching actually, some churchmen argued that Hermeticism should be incorporated into Christian teaching. Some argued that Christian teaching should be incorporated into Hermeticism. And 1 or 2, and I'm thinking of one in particular here, argued, forget the Christianity, let's just have Hermeticism. And the big figure that I'm talking about here, who strides like a colossus through this story, is one Giordano Bruno, who was active in the late 16th century, who started off as a Dominican monk in Naples, where he distinguished himself by sitting for long hours in the loo reading heretical works. And as a result of that, he became the Inquisition's most wanted. Not the result of sitting in the loo for hours, the result of reading the heretical works. And so he was basically a fugitive, and he just legged it around Europe. But they did, well, no, I'm not going to get ahead of me. I'm not going to get ahead of myself, but I think you can work out what actually happened to him in the end. But tragically, even scandalously, Bruno has been very largely airbrushed out of history. He's making something of a comeback because he's the star in historical thrillers of S.J. Paris's novels. But I think a lot of people think that he was just invented. Bruno, what did Bruno actually believe? Bruno believed that Hermeticism represented the original religion. He thought there was one fated, destined original religion, but it was corrupted and twisted and perverted, first by the Jews and then by the Christians. He also believed the Hermetic prediction that the ancient Egyptian religion, because to him that was the real original religion, would be restored. And he believed it would be restored in his lifetime. And guess who he thought would do the restoration? Giordano Bruno. But you know, I mean, I'm sorry, you shouldn't laugh because it was a terribly tragic story, but it is, again, retrospectively, from the 21st century looking back, extraordinarily naive. But he was a very arrogant man, and he didn't even consider any drawbacks. But obviously, shall we say, let's think about this. Imposing the ancient Egyptian religion in Europe in his day would involve, shall we say, somewhat radical reform of the church, returning it perhaps to its Egyptian roots. Well, again, he wasn't a beardy man. I mean, or rather, he wasn't just a beardy man. He wasn't a nobody. Bruno was actually, as he was running around being chased by the Inquisition for years in Europe, he managed to become friends and influence on the likes of Shakespeare and William Gilbert, an early scientist, and also Elizabeth I, the King of France, who was his sponsor for a long time, and even the Holy Roman Emperor. So we're not looking, at somebody who just did the Hermetic porn thing. We're looking at somebody who was really possibly a prime mover, and he was pushing and pushing and pushing. He wanted, basically he would go to the leaders of Protestant countries, because even he didn't think he stood much chance in Catholic countries. And he would basically influence the leaders, influence the monarchs. And they thought he was great on the whole. He also established a secret society. Again, this is quite sweet, because he wasn't stuck for self-belief. He called it the Giordanisti, after him, Giordano Bruno. It's like calling it the Linneys, really. I say modesty was not his strong point. The idea of the Giordanisti was to campaign for religious reform, which of course, I mean, it was a very secret society. It's so secret that very few of even you would have heard of it. It took me by surprise. But the Giordanisti were definitely there, secretly networking, and of course another headache for the church. I talk about paranoia. Bruno believed, and a lot, as you just said, Hermeticists believe, that a widespread conversion to heliocentricity, to the recognition that the sun is at the center, would in itself overturn Christianity and usher in the ancient Egyptian religion and bring in an age of Hermetic enlightenment. Now that's a huge ambition. It's a huge thought, but it shows you how the Hermeticists thought of the great new discoveries and talking points as actually being linked to mysticism and linked to belief. Well, not unnaturally, yet again, the Inquisition pricked up their ears. And, they really would not have missed Copernicus' own reference to Hermes Trismegistus. What with that, and now Bruno, the political element here, the Inquisition were thinking, was heliocentricity a devilish Hermetic plot all along, from Copernicus onwards? So in 1592, they finally caught up with Bruno, who rather stupidly walked into a trap, and as the guests of the Inquisition, he spent 8 years in jail, and then he was burnt at the stake in Rome in 1600. His tongue was tied beforehand, so he couldn't address the crowds. It would have been very interesting indeed to hear what he'd had to say, but we won't. We never did, and we won't. But was that really the end of his extraordinary reforming quotes, plans? Well, no, it wasn't, because basically the Vatican went on being terrified. The Giordanisti, the secret society, were continuing, and they were. There was a new kid on the block called Tommaso Campanella, who even tried to organize an armed uprising in Naples to establish the ideal Hermetic Republic. Now, quite clearly he didn't succeed, because if he had succeeded, we'd all know about it. You know, it'd be on Yesterday Channel, the whole series about it. But no, he failed, and we only know a little bit about it. And Tommaso Campanella was imprisoned for the next 25 years. But it all puts a new perspective on the Inquisition's desire to suppress Galileo when he came along. Bruno and Galileo moved in very much the same circles, so instantly Galileo was tarred with Bruno's brush, and Galileo was, for all sorts of reasons, but specifically because of his connection with Bruno, immediately on the Inquisition's watch list. And within 15 years, actually, of Bruno's death, Galileo came up with evidence for the heliocentric theory through a newfangled device called a telescope. And at that point, it was all right to have it as a theory. I mean, even that was a bit problematic, but theory is one thing. But now he had evidence, and he was warned by the Inquisition not to promote the theory as fact. It was only then that the Church pronounced Copernicus's theory, retrospectively, contrary to Christian teaching. Thank you, Bruno. Another 15 years later, Galileo published a dialogue between the two chief world systems and was famously tried for breaking the earlier ban, found guilty of heresy and condemned, very lucky man, condemned to life imprisonment, house imprisonment, sorry. Campanella wrote to Galileo urging him to stand firm because of the spiritual importance of establishing heliocentricity. Now, Galileo knew how significant heliocentricity was to the Hermeticists, and the Inquisition knew he knew. And the dialogue, by the way, is even modelled on one of Bruno's books. In reality, Galileo's trial was modelled was actually all about the Hermetic reform agenda.